Hi everyone, my name is Robert Wittkamp and here I am with another lecture on classical Japanese literature. Actually, in this and the next lectures I will be talking about the haiku poet Santoka, Takeda Santoka, whose poetry belongs to modern literature. However, Santoka's haiku are closely related to classical Japanese poetry, and my first two Santoka lectures will deal with questions of reading, interpretation, and translation. Here you can see the English translations I'm going to present. There are other translations within literary histories and a book with translations by Hiroaki Sato, but I will limit myself to these four. However, I will present the English translations, but I am not going to discuss them or to assess them. I leave this to you, of course, after listening to my lectures. Aside from the seminal article by James Abrams published in 1977 in Monumenta Nipponica, there are these two books that are considered the standard collections in English to date. In English, by the way, the name Takeda Santoka has become common, but in Japanese it is usually just Santoka. This is consistent since Santoka is a pen name that does not require a family name. Last summer I was finally able to receive the book by William Scott Wilson that came out earlier in 2021. You can see the book on this slide, and its title is The Life and Then Haiku Poetry of Santoka Takeda, Japan's most beloved modern haiku poet. As you can see, the book is a translation of a Japanese book by Sumita Oyama Sumita in Japanese, who was a close friend of Santoka. He was born in 1899, 7 years after Santoka, and passed away in 1994. The English book has a preface and introduction by William Scott Wilson, and it also contains another translation, The Diary of the One Grass Hut, Isoan Nikki in Japanese, which is Santoka's last diary contained in volume 10 of Santoka Zenshu, a collection of Santoka's works in 11 volumes. In 1990, I bought the Japanese books, among other books, to prepare my master thesis on Santoka, and it is still in my bookshelf. The book, which was published in 1983, seems to be a part of a series of books. I myself still own these two other books, which you can see here, and who knows, maybe Mr. Wilson will also translate these ones. Their titles in English are Santoka's Way, Santoka no Michi, and Santoka no Yado, dealing with the places where he stayed during his many travels. I didn't open the Japanese books for many years, and when I did, it was somehow funny and natsukashi, nostalgic, to see all the notes I have written into the books when I still was a beginner in reading Japanese. I started to read the English book here and there a little, and after some pages I saw a haiku, which is in my mind all the time. This haiku made me decide to add Santoka to my YouTube lectures on classical Japanese literature. However, I have to postpone this haiku because the first two lectures are dedicated to fundamental questions: how to read, how to interpret, and how to translate Santoka's haiku. Well, let me briefly introduce this modern haiku poet known as Santoka. When he was born in December 1882, his name was Taneda Shoichi, and he was not born into a poor family, but his father was obviously not the frugal type and ended up leading the family into poverty. However, the biggest shock in Santoka's childhood was to see his mother, Fusa, was brought up from the well into which she threw herself to finish her life. Santoka was just 10 years old. However, he was an excellent student, and in 1902 he moved to Tokyo to enter the literature department of the famous Waseda University, Waseda Daigaku. He only stayed until the next year in Tokyo and moved back home. He married Sato Sakino, and their son Ken was born the next year, but family life was not for Santoka. While he devoted himself more and more to literary work, he also began to drink more. In 1913, he became a member of the haiku magazine Soun, which was directed by his mentor and haiku poet Ogiwara Seisensui. And he started to publish free haiku, Jiuritsu haiku, using his pen name Santoka. In 1916, the Tanira family estate went bankrupt, and Santoka moved to Kumamoto with his wife and child. In October 1919, he traveled back to Tokyo, and the next year he divorced his wife. He continued to stay in Tokyo, where he then witnessed the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, which killed over 130,000 people. He left Tokyo and returned to Kumamoto. One day in 1924, he was so drunk that he stood in front of a streetcar and stopped it. A Buddhist monk saw this and took care of him. That was a triggering moment for Santoka's career as a Zen monk. He was put in charge of a small temple in Kumamoto, the Mitori Kanondo, but he did not endure being in charge very long. He left the temple in 1926, and that was the beginning of his begging and wandering years. This life eventually continued until his death. He had a hut here and there for a short time, and also some friends who supported him. But his life consisted of long and lonely wandering, much sake, and even more haiku. In 1939, Santoka went on a pilgrimage and visited the 88 temples in Shikoku. In Matsuyama, the haiku capital, he finally found a hut where he was allowed to live. This was the mentioned Isuan, the one grass hut. The next year, Santoka died there after a haiku meeting. He lived to the age of 58. Okay, Santoka is well known, and I have occasionally had the opportunity to participate in haiku meetings of associations that preserve haiku in the classical style according to Basho's haiku. I sometimes ask the participants about Santoka. They all knew him, but only a few recognized his so-called free haiku, his jiuritsu haiku, as haiku. This is not because of the content, but because of the form. As you might know, the free haiku does not require a seasonal word, a kigo, or a fixed number of syllables, 575. Let us start with the question of what is meant in Japanese by jiuritsu haiku, free haiku. I'm reading and quoting from a dictionary. Tanka matawa haiku no ichi yoshiki. Zairai no 31字または17字の形式を破ったもの。短歌では前田夕暮れ、俳句では川東碧子と荻原聖泉水らが提唱。So it is a style, a form in tanka, this is a Japanese short poem, and in haiku. Zairai no 31字 So it broke with the traditional 31 syllable poems, the tanka, and with the 17 syllables of the haiku. Tanka de wa Maeda Yugure, as in tanka it was Maeda Yugure, and in haiku it was Kawa Higashi Heikikoto and Ogiwara Seisensuri and others who proclaimed the movement. The quote comes from the renowned Kojien, but whenever I am reading this, I can't shake the feeling that the word Yabutta has something negative attached to it, because Yabutta also means to destroy. But what Santoka does is no destruction, but to liberate, to free. And I'm going to show this. Before getting into practice, I would like to state that three aspects are important for understanding Santoka's haiku. First, the connections with classical poetry. Second, form and rhythm. And finally, the sound. I will go into the connections with classical poetry later, but before we have to deal with the material aspects of rhythm and sound. In the case of sound, in turn, two aspects can be distinguished, namely, on the one hand, the sound of the words or syllables themselves, the sound of the poem, and on the other hand, the sound of the words and syllables as an imitation of reality. This aspect is usually described as onomatopoeia. And I would like to make a remark on the linguistic basic. In the so-called dyadic sign or sign model, signs consist of two components which are described as signified or content and signifier from or form in English. Since Ferdinand de Saussure, we know that the relation of the two components is arbitrary. Thus, there are no natural reasons why, for example, the English word tree must be so named. In German, one says Baum, in Spanish, Árbol, and in Chinese, Mu. In pre-modern poetry, however, attempts are often made to erase this randomness and more closely link form with content. However, this is hardly possible in traditional haiku poetry because, first, Japanese has many homonyms. Secondly, however, and this reason is important, the fixed form of 17 syllables does not leave much room for maneuver. Of course, the fixed form also has a meaning, especially the connection to classical Japanese poetry. The classical haiku form is an expression of cultural identity and cultural memory, and therefore so important. So what Santoka and other adepts of the free haiku movement accomplished was not the destruction of the fixed form, but the liberation of the form. They reopened the form to the content, and therefore it is extremely important to pay attention to these aspects of form in interpretation and in translation. As an aside, the English translations often happen in 3 lines, although the free haiku in Japanese appear only in 1 or in 2 lines when the poem is longer or there is not enough space. This is probably an attempt by the translators to put the content of the poem into a form. The only question is whether this is sufficient. In Japanese printed collections, the haiku usually appear in only 1 line. On this slide you can see so-called tanzaku. They were all inscribed by Santoka, and you can see that he had a very distinctive handwriting. Whether a haiku appears in 1 or 2 lines is a matter of the size of the handwriting and the paper. The haiku on the right side is found in 2 variants, one with a karuru at the end, the original version, and one with mo yuru at the end. Unfortunately, my reading ability is not sufficient to identify the last line. Please let me know if anyone can read it. I'll come back to the haiku on the left, but you can see that it is written once in 1 line and the other time in 2 lines. The 2 large and colorful tanzaku come from the collection of a former colleague. I was allowed to photograph these and others, and I will hopefully be able to introduce them one day. In any case, I would like to thank my colleague, Mr. Tanaka. These tanzaku bring me to another aspect that is also important for printed haiku, namely the materiality of writing. For example, it is important whether a word is written with hiragana phonograms or with Chinese characters. Okay, here comes my first example. Karete kare kite ishi koro goro goro. The haiku consists of 16 syllables, but 2 halves of 8 syllables can be distinguished. You can see the structure on this slide. The structure of 16 syllables is typical of Santoka's haiku, and I will discuss another example later. What we don't see is a season word, but in fact the season is expressed. It is winter, the season when it is usually dry, or at least used to be dry. The word karu in classical Japanese poetry, or kareru, to dry, in modern Japanese also refers to the plants that have dried up in winter and come to life again or explode in summer as natsukusa, summer plants, summer grass. Dryness is emphasized by the two words, but by the repetition karete, karekite, but these two words also serve another function. The hard sound of the consonants k, k, makes audible the sound of stones rolling down a slope, bumping against each other. These rolling stones are then made the subject of the second half, ishikoro goro goro. The translation by John Stevens captures the content quite well, although parched can be somewhat misleading, as some dictionaries tend to associate it with heat. That would be summer. Roll and roll, on the other hand, render the goro goro very nicely, as well as rolling, tumbling. However, what is not taken into account in both translations is the syllable structure. To emphasize that here once again, precisely because the form is free, it must be taken into account in the translation. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same syllable structure, but a form must be recognizable. Wilson's translations are principally done in 3 lines, and thus they are just as rigid as the fixed form in traditional haiku. Let us take another look at the material level of sound, this time at the vowels. Now we see that the first half consists of light vowels, but in the second half the dark O vowels dominate. In Japan, the A vowel is among the light sounds, but O and U are considered as dark. The haiku thus shows an opposition of light and dark sounds in the two halves, but what that means is a matter of interpretation. For this, of course, it is important to realize what a lonely and long walking means. I will try an interpretation later on another poem. So we see that altogether the content was translated. However, the material aspects of the sound, that is the opposition of light and dark vowels, as well as the hard k, k consonants, are hardly taken into account, and the rhythm also is missing. It is, of course, extremely difficult to translate all aspects of form and content artfully, but when comparing different translations, I sometimes wonder if these aspects have been recognized or considered at all. In this haiku, of course, koro, goro, goro is too striking not to be recognized. In other haiku, however, you have to look much closer. Here comes my second example. Tabi no kakioki kakikaete oku. If we first look at the syllable structure and rhythm, the structure of 2 halves of 7 syllables each stands out. The internal structure of the 2 halves consists of 3-4 and 4-3 syllables, so the inner rhythm is a converse. In the translation, the word before stands out because it does not exist in the original poem. It may be that Stevens chose the word to approximate the rhythm, or it is the result of his interpretation of kakioki, which is to write something to leave it for the future or for someone. His translation consists of 2 halves with 6 and 7 syllables, 7 and 6 syllables respectively. But let's ask ourselves honestly, what is actually interesting about this haiku? There must be at least something that intrigued Stevens. However, in my understanding, the content is rather not so interesting, and therefore I looked for the answer in the material aspects of the form. Repeated reading in a loud voice makes it clear what it is all about. Then the many k consonants are noticeable. As seen, this can have 2 causes, namely, on the one hand, the sound of the words themselves, for example, as opposition of light and dark vowels, or it is again about the sound of the real world, which is imitated as onomatopoeia. But what then does it mean? To answer this question, we have to consider the content of the poem, which is about writing. Kakioku means to write something down, kakikaeru, to write something again. And oku at the end is an auxiliary verb, here translated as to put down. I think that Stevens' before is a permissible interpretation, as long as we don't take it as a temporal separation before the journey and during the journey. Before the trip is wrong because tabi no kakioki are notes written during the journey. It could be records from the previous day of the trip, but that is not so important. In my interpretation, the haiku gives the picture of a traveler who perhaps sits in front of his notes in the evening, writes, erases or crosses out, and rewrites. The k consonants present nothing else than the sound produced by the pencil on the rough paper of the early 20th century. It is exactly this material aspect of sound imitation that makes a haiku enduring. In German, for example, there are the words kritzeln or krakeln. They mean, among other things, a shaky, unclean writing, but without doubt also possess this onomatopoeic aspect. And here comes my next example. Ame furu furusato wa harashi de aruku. This haiku consists of 16 syllables, but the structure is extremely complicated because the rhythm changes according to the reading. Before I get to that, however, I would like to analyze the material aspects of sound again. In his book Santoka no Michi, which belongs to the series I have mentioned, Oyama Sumita introduces the haiku. According to him, Santoka came back to his old home for the first time after 14 years. He returned as a mendicant monk, and since his straw sandals had worn through, he had to go barefoot. But that was not a problem, since it was still warm enough. Oyama then draws attention to the 6 R vowels that dominate the haiku. Although Santoka was a beggar, he was not embarrassed, and Oyama hears a joyful, a pleasant walking from the bright R sounds. Since the ground in the area was very sandy, walking barefoot was not uncomfortable for the feet. The wa, ha in furusato wa, Oyama explains, indicates the leisurely, pleasurable walking. Indeed, looking at the vowels, the dominance of clear and bright R sounds is striking. But as you can see, that's not all, because these light R sounds are in opposition to the dark U sounds. Oyama strangely does not mention them, although they also occur in 6 times. The alternation of A and U sounds occurs frequently in Santoka's haiku and, incidentally, was well known to Basho too. Another typical Santoka combination is that of E and U vowels. In the book translated by William Scott Wilson, Oyama mentioned this haiku too. In this book, he introduces the haiku as follows in Wilson's translation. After walking a while, a gentle rain began to fall. His straw hat was a big one, and so he didn't get very wet. The sandy earth of this southern area was as pure as sandy beach, and as it was damp, he was very happy to step on it with bare feet. Oyama put the haiku into a narrative framework that is nice, but does not match the entry in Santoka's diary, where the haiku first appears. Perhaps Santoka told Oyama a different story, or Oyama's narrative is based on a so-called false memory. Be that as it may, what is important is the assertion that Santoka was very happy. Also important is the description of the area around Santoka's hometown, where the soil is or was apparently very sandy. Santoka goes barefoot and apparently enjoys it. It is the childish pleasure of stepping barefoot into a puddle that can be heard. In this Hadashi de Aruku is something that is expressed in German platsch or patsch, the sound of stepping with bare feet into a warm paddle of water on sandy ground. Well, if the joyful feeling is expressed through the light A vowels, what do the dark U vowels stand for? Here, Santoka's diaries, letters to his friends, or haiku may help us, because from these we know that he suffered from an ambivalent feeling. When he was traveling, he suffered from homesickness, but when he was back home, he couldn't bear it very long and wanted to leave again as soon as possible. It's a kind of Goethe's Zwei Herzen wohnen ach in meiner Brust, two hearts dwell alas in my breast. I promised an interpretation. Well, I read the dark vowels as expression of the depressive, while the light ones express happiness. But that alone is not enough, of course. Therefore, we still have to look for other clues. To accomplish this, I approach the haiku from two directions. First, through other textual sources, and second, through the haiku itself. In 1936, 4 years later, Santoka traveled in Basho's footsteps and also visited Hiraizumi. This was the northernmost point on the Pacific side in the Okonosumichi journey, and also the point of turning back for Santoka. He was very frustrated, depressive, which I will talk about in the next lecture. And at one stop on his return trip, he wrote a letter to a friend on June 13. The letters and other documents are included in the volume 11 of the Santoka Zenshu, the complete edition of Santoka's works. Okay, I'm going to quote from the letter. There are two me's living inside me. It's rather so that I am disconnected into two me's. That's the reason I wrote, sometimes it's or I am clear, sometimes it's or I am muddy. And in my clear times I try to live a truly pure life and write poems, but in my muddy times I become absolutely nihilistic and desperate. I fall in something one can call a moral paralysis, do tokuteki mahisho. I have struggled with this contradiction for many years, and so on. So we see that Goethe and Santoka suffered from a similar inner split, even if the nature of the two parts were completely different. Well, in Goethe's case, it is the literary character who laments the two hearts. And here it is Santoka. Okay, this is going too far, and I want to bring the focus back to the haiku. The first thing that stands out here is the repetition furu furu, which is written entirely with hiragana phonograms. We can read ame furu, it rains, or ame furu furu, it rains and rains, expressing a continuity. We can read the first 8 syllables ame furu and furusato, it rains and home, or we can read ame furu furu and furusato, it rains and rains, the homeland. You can see that the translation by William Scott Wilson as raining in my hometown, considers Santoka's technique. This technique comes from the classical waka poetry and is called kake kotoba. A word or a word component has a semantic relation to the preceding syllables and at the same time to the syllables that follow. By the way, in the town of Hofu, where Santoka was born, there is a kuhi, a stone with a haiku inscribed on it, and the haiku is the same, is this Amifuru haiku. The inscription from 1945 is by Oyama Sumita, but Santoka's Furufuru was written with Chinese characters. Thus, of course, the kakekotoba technique is lost. But something else also is lost. at least Oyama did not include this writing in his book. For now that we are at the hiragana phonograms and kakikotoba technique, something else stands out. Since our reading eye is now sufficiently sensitized to the materiality of the writing, the two syllables ha-ha, which read as one word, ha-ha, meaning mother, should be noticeable. And now it is necessary to recall what Santoka experienced in his childhood and what probably shaped his whole life, the suicide of his mother, Haha, when he was just 10 years old. It is the same technique as in Furu Furu, and in it the high complexity of the poem is also evident. Of course, all this is a matter of interpretation, but as long as one can prove one's interpretation by the text and other sources, it is a permissible interpretation. After all, what we are dealing with is literature, and one characteristic of literature is its ambiguity, its polysemy. By the way, this haiku is a good example to apply Nelson Goodman's model of symbols. Symbolizing is for Goodman the same as referring, and denotation and exemplification are the two fundamental forms of reference. Denotation is the relationship between a so-called label, such as ame or furusato, and what it labels, here, the rain and homeland. Exemplification, on the other hand, requires possession. Exemplification is possession plus reference. This possession in this haiku is the state of a falling and falling rain, and the sound when the bare feet hit the water of a puddle on sandy ground. Expression is the third important symbol in Goodman's theory. I am not qualified enough to explain it here in the given shortness of time, and I limit myself to an example. A dark and grey landscape painting denotes a dark and grey landscape, exemplifies grey, and possibly expresses sadness or loneliness. Our haiku denotes continuing rain in a place called homeland and someone walking barefoot on a sandy and wet ground. It exemplifies the state of the falling rain, ? And the sound of the bare feet stepping into a puddle, German Platsch or Patsch. And it expresses an opposition of the depressive U vowels versus happiness in A vowels. Next, of course, we would have to ask how these three types of symbols are realized in translation, but that would be your homework, so to speak. I have talked a lot about sound in Santoka's poetry so far, and I think that Santoka can be understood as a mimi no haijin, a poet of the ear. I would like to give another example of Santoka's masterful handling of the level of sound and the use of kakikotoba. But this haiku will also show how complex Santoka's poems can be, even though they look very simple at first. Horo horo yotte, konoha furu. The haiku is included in the collection Hachinoko, the begging bowl, which was Santoka's first collection, and the collection contains most of his famous haiku. It was published in 1933 and is known to be a very rigorous selection by Santoka and his mentor Ogiwara Seisensui. It contains a haiku that were considered the best of the best haiku at the time. The fact that all four translators tried their hand at this haiku shows a certain quality, but the haiku is not necessarily always understood. This is shown by this quote from a book in which Wajun Takao tries to bring Santoka's haiku closer to the Japanese reader. The book contains many photographs made by Nakazato Kazuto. I translate the Japanese text. Also, one of the characteristics of Santoka's poetry is his sokenai, treatment of nature. Sokenai means blunt, cold, short, or brisk. For example, If he looked at the leaves falling in a drunken mood, he made a poem. I am drunk and the leaves are falling. That's all. Or no more. Tonaru dake. Tonaru dake. He had no connection to the beauty of the nature of the four seasons. Nature was not something to be praised, sanbi, to praise, to glorify, to admire, or admired, kansho, to enjoy, view for pleasure, or to admire. Of course, it remains to be clarified what nature has to do with poetry, but the statement, tonaru dake, that's all or nothing more, shows a deep non-understanding. And in the rest of this lecture, I will prove it. It will take a couple of times, please be patient. The poem consists of 12 syllables with a rhythm 7 and 5. The first half can be split into 4 and 3 syllables, but we have to see the traditional 7-5 unit. As an aside, we can see that all translators but Burton Watson always use punctuation. This can be a big problem, but I'll go to that in my next Santoka lecture. William Scott Wilson added a note to the word horo. He explains the Japanese word horo as mimesis, implying pleasantly, scatteringly, or melodiously. So the word refers on the one hand to the drunken speaker in the haiku, and on the other hand to the falling leaves. Therefore, we can speak again of a kakekotoba technique as well, except that the two semantically different references involve words that both follow after the expression. Well, concerning the leaves, horo doesn't just mean to fall, to scatter, but what John Stevens translated as one by one. As in horo, this is also a repetition, and coincidentally a repetition of o vowels. In modern Japanese, the second part would be ki no ha furu, but the traditional reading in waka poetry is ko no ha. Moreover, ko fits much better with the other dark vowels, and ki would almost be almost distracting. Wilson, by the way, includes the Japanese text, but this is only helpful for those who can read Japanese. Translations of Japanese haiku, however, must, and this should have become clear so far, necessarily also have a transliteration. As we can see from this slide, horo means much more. These explanations are again from the standard dictionary Kojien. I'm going to read them and to explain them. Number 1. Ki no ha naru ga chiru sama. The leaves of a tree are falling down, or something else is falling down. Number 2. Hito ga chiri ni naru sama. People who were together before now are getting apart. Everyone is going his own way. Number 3. Kimono naru ga kurake yabureru sama. Clothing are getting old and falling apart. Number 4. Nabida no kobore ochiru sama. Boro. So it's the tears rolling down or falling down, also expressed as boro. Number 5. Mono no ku oto. Pori. The sound of eating something, also pori. Number 6. Kiji ya yamadori no nakigoe. Kiji, the pheasant, or other birds from the mountains. The cry of the pheasant or other birds of the mountain. For Santoka's personal life, points 2 and 3 also may be important, but horo is a word from traditional waka and haiku poetry. These aspects are expressed in points 4 and 5. There is, for example, a well-known haiku by Basho that begins with horo. Santoka's haiku continually refer to Basho's haiku, and we can only understand Santoka's work in his engagement with Basho's poetry. I think it would be very interesting to read the poetry of Basho and Santoka in the sense of Harold Bloom's book, The Anxiety of Influence, because both poets are what Bloom calls a strong poet. In any case, it is certain that Santoka had an excellent knowledge of traditional waka and haiku poetry. After all, he did not only study literature at Waseda University, even if only briefly. It is known from his diaries and other sources that he spent a lot of time reading. Basho's haiku is from the travel writing Oi no Kobumi. The translation by Stephen D. Carter is by Stephen D. Carter, but interesting for us now is only the material level of the sound. We see that Basho's haiku also begins with dark O vowels and ends with them as well. I have shown elsewhere that Basho's Horo Horo haiku must be read in the context of the travel writing Oi no Kobumi, since Basho changes the traditional reference of Horo Horo. Namely, he dissolves the traditional reference to the call of the pheasant, the kiji. The pheasant appears shortly after the Horo Horo haiku in another haiku, and Basho thematizes the pheasant's piercing cry. The expression Horo Horo no longer appears there, only shrill E sounds. And Santoka is doing something very similar. He takes up Basho's haiku and again assigns different contents to the ingredients. On this slide we can see that Santoka could spend a long time on one subject. It comes from his diary of November 7, 1939. Horo horo horobiyuki, watakushi, watakshi no aki. I think it is very well done, but it was never included in the collection. However, it is an example of the opposition of U and I vowels I have mentioned earlier. It is interesting that this opposition is contained in the second half and at the same time connecting masterfully both parts. The dark O sounds are exclusively within the first 6 syllables. Important is that the combination with horobiyuki gives horo horo another nuance of meaning. Horobiru in modern Japanese or horobu in classical Japanese means go to ruin, fall into ruin, go under, perish. And yuku expresses a process of or continuity. Now we have to remember that furu in the haiku, horo horo yote konoha furu, also is a kakikotoba from classical Japanese literature. One meaning is getting old or being old. Watakushi, watakshi, means I, and aki is autumn. So together they mean my autumn, standing for the end of my life. It is essential to see that watakushi is written with hiragana phonograms. In fact, the Chinese character for I can also be read watashi, but in the haiku, the repetition of U and I is crucial, introduced by the hard K consonant. Now we know that horo horo is a very complex word. We also know that Santoka was a friend of sake, so it may also be interesting to know what is meant by horo horo as a description of a state under the influence of alcohol. Here again the diaries help us, and there is a very nice entry from the summer of 1935. I am going to read it and then explain it. Suichu mangen is something you are saying, not very deep content while you are drunken. Ippai, tozai nashi, so one glass and there is no more east and west, there is no more space. Nihai, kokin nashi, 2 glasses and there is no old and new, there is no more time. Sanpai, jita nashi, 3 glasses and there is no more difference between me, the self, and the other. Sake ga kita, I have some alcohol, I have something to drink. Shigeaki-kun Omaneku, I don't know how to read this name, I think it's Shigeaki. So I invited Shigeaki-kun. sorekara, and then, sorekara, horo horo, toro toro, doro doro, boro boro, goro goro. So we see that here in this description, horo horo is the first phase of getting drunk. But there's one more meaning to consider, and I'll stop here. Horo horo appears in several dialects with different meanings, but in the prefecture of Yamaguchi it means to complain, grumbling, to mutter. Santoka was born in Yamaguchi. I would like to summarize my observations with a haiku written by a well-known poet who studied Santoka for a long time and who wrote several books about him, Kaneko Tota. Sake yamioka donohonoto asoboka. My translation is not particularly poetic, especially the somehow ugly word alcohol, which has nothing to do with poetry. But we see immediately that this haiku is dominated by dark O holes. The picture of the poem is that the speaker was advised, possibly by the doctor, to stop drinking alcohol, and the dark O sounds nicely reflect the discontented grumbling of the speaker, presumably the grumbling of an old man. The haiku has no seasonal word, and the structure is also not in accordance with tradition. However, I think that there is no one who would call this one free haiku, jiu-jitsu haiku. We can see that Kaneko chose the haiku as the title of a book, his autobiography. Of course, the connection of the two haiku is purely speculative, but I think it is a nice and creative connection. And that concludes the first part of this lecture. Thank you very much. Actually, there's something I would like to say, because I realize that this time my voice is a little strange, because there's always a little echo to hear. But I couldn't find the reason for this technical problem. But now I realize that while speaking, I have to switch off the computer sound, the computer speaker. But please do understand that I don't want to do all this recording again. So please be patient, and next time I will fix this problem. Thank you very much.